It's fine. Either seat is fine.
You can't see
You can't see either.
It's okay.
This one's fine too. Good morning, Shabbat Shalom. It is such a joy to begin together. We are going to begin as we always do with a bracha.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Ve'arevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu ובפי עמך בית ישראל. ונהיה אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאי עמך בית ישראל, כולנו יודעי שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה. ברוך אתה אדוני המלמד תורה לעמו ישראל. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר בחר בנו מכל העמים, ונתן לנו את תורתו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
So this morning we are talking about anti-Semitism, specifically how we can respond to anti-Semitism, and it's so intense to see the ways in which anti-Semitism is rising in our world. Just yesterday I received an email forwarded from a member that was sent by Newton South Community. I'm just going to read this email to you. Dear Newton South Community, I'm writing to share with you that this afternoon at Newton South, a student reported to a staff member that they had discovered 2 3-inch swastikas written on the tile in a boys' room bathroom stall. In response to this incident, we are following our protocols put in place to address acts of hate, bias, and discrimination. These protocols include informing the Newton Police and the Anti-Defamation League, as well as conducting an investigation to identify the individual or individuals who committed the act. If your student has any information regarding this hateful incident, please encourage them to speak with their counselor or team. As we know, anti-Semitism is on the rise in the world, and this incident reminds us that we need to be vigilant. I continue to be saddened and angered by the violations of our core values within our student community. As a school, we strive to create an inclusive and welcoming environment free of hate. We will continue this work and will not be deterred by this or any other incident like it. Respectfully, Mark Aronson, the interim principal. This is just this week at Newton South High School. This is something that's happening across our country, across the world. And it's so disheartening, especially for a generation that grew up on the wisdom of Oprah and The Secret, the idea that you can create what you want to create by your internal reality. If you don't see it, if you don't think about it, if you don't focus on it, hatred will just go away and we can all live forever and always in peace and happiness and everything that's good. Unfortunately, our people has too much experience dealing with anti-Semitism. And so today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at liturgy that evolved throughout our history. And interestingly, a surprisingly large amount of our liturgy evolved during the periods of greatest persecution and pieces of liturgy that you might not expect. Before we jump into liturgy, I just want to share a little bit of history. We're talking about the medieval period. The first crusade took place in 1096, and that was attacking Jews of the Rhineland. That's Worms, that's Speyer, that's Cologne. And basically, crusaders were on their way to Jerusalem to rescue the city from the Saracens, but on their way, they pillaged and plundered Jewish towns, murdered. They would take captives and then have horrible mobs of attacking them. This was followed by various edicts, mostly coming from the church. In 1233, Pope Gregory IX established the Permanent Inquisition, and that basically set a mob of Dominican friars who would condemn heretics to the stake. The lynching scenes of this country, that was what it looked like in Eastern Europe, with Jews burned at the stake. And that continued on and on and on. When the Crusaders finally made it to Jerusalem, they shepherded all the Jews into a synagogue and burned that synagogue to the ground. There was the Black Death in the 14th century and blood libels all across Europe. There was the edict in the mid-16th century, which forced all Jews into ghettos. And of course, the rules that required Jews to only perform specific jobs in themselves, like money lending, which then led to anti-Semitic tropes such as being overly greedy or stingy, or only interested in your own interest, only interested in power. And so here we are in this interesting space. We've never had more more power. We've never had more freedom. We never had more ability to fight anti-Semitism. And in some ways, I feel like we've also never felt so lost as to how to do it. So we're going to take a look at these liturgies. We're going to start with a prayer of Harachamim, which evolved just during this Inquisition as a way of honoring those whose souls had been lost to the Crusades. So, Elias, I'm wondering if you could read just the first part of this blessing. We're on source number 1.
Good morning, everybody. The Father of mercy, who dwells on high, in his great mercy will remember with compassion the pious, upright, and blameless, the holy communities who lay down their lives for the sanctification of his name. They were loved and pleasant in their lives, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles and stronger than lions to carry out the will of their Maker.
I'm going to pause us here. And I just want to ask, what's this response to anti-Semitism? What is this response to this Crusades? How is the Jewish community incorporating their experiences into liturgy?
I would say so far, this appears to be pain, loss, and lifting up of legacy, right? The idea that they lived for something, they were committed to values and ideals we hold dear. And this is really about them, not about the people who murdered them.
In other words, taking the legacy of these people out of the hands of the Crusaders, lifting them up, and it's as if they've been able to isolate themselves from the anti-Semitism that caused the pain, and they're able to just...
Yeah, I mean, we'll continue on, I think, and see sort of a slightly different voice. But I think that at this moment, it reminds me back when Columbine happened, and there was this horrific school shooting, and there became a real social twist that instead of repeatedly covering the murderers and those who commit these atrocities, we would focus on those whose lives had been lost.
Mm-hmm. Dan, will you keep going? Keep reading?
Sure. May our Lord remember them for good, together with other righteous of the world, and may he redress the spilled blood of his servants, as it is written in the Torah of Moses, the man of God. O nations, make his people rejoice, for he will redress the blood of his servants. He will retaliate against his enemies and appease his land and his people. And through your servants, the prophets, it is written, though I forgive their bloodshed, I shall not forgive, when God dwells in Zion. And in the holy writings it says, why should the nations say, where is their God? Let it be known among the nations in our sight that you avenge the spilled blood of your servants. And it says, for he who exacts retribution for spilled blood remembers them. He does not forget the cry of the humble. And it says, he will execute judgment among the corpse-filled nations, crushing the rulers of the mighty. And from the brook by the wayside he will drink, then he will hold his head high.
Slightly different tone at the end there.
So can I put into context something? So this
Please
is
do.
coming from the Orthodox Sidurim, most of them. Our Sidur doesn't have this prayer. And you can see here in this text that it's also the El Maleh Rahamim that we are going to talk later, but they are the same. What I find interesting is that this prayer, that it's harsh at times, it's not recited on Hagim and on special holidays. We are very good people in those days, you know? On regular Shabbatot, we do this, but not on holidays. So I just needed to bring that up. I find it interesting, the distinction.
Yeah, I just want to say also this, this also reminds me of, the Psalm Al Naharot Bavel. You read through it and we are weeping and we are crying, and then oftentimes you would find musical settings that would not include the last, 2 verses, which says, happy are they who smash the heads of the children on rocks. We don't get that. We don't get that anger most of the time, but it's there, and it's here also. So that actually reminded me of this moment where we remember the souls of those who have passed, but also in a very human way we are asking God to be a vengeful God. And God says in the Torah, that I'm a vengeful God. And so this we're asking God to do what God says.
Right. And I think one of the things I find so interesting is that actually our evolution, the language at the beginning, and especially if you hear it in the Hebrew, Av harachamim shochein meromim, right, is so similar to El Male Rachamim. We've taken the way that our liturgy evolved. It's actually been the practice of Jews since the Gaonic period to honor the dead and to make sacrifices for the dead. And there were rituals that accounted for that, but it didn't become formalized until this period of the Crusades. And it came specifically out of the experience of watching communities be decimated by crusaders and having no recourse, and then developing this prayer to lift up the souls of those who had been lost to the Crusades. And then it became a practice sort of naturally after that to honor loved ones on their yard sites. But during the peak of the Crusades, this was recited every single Shabbat. Every single Shabbat. And then from that evolves our rituals. And it wasn't actually until I think the 16th century that we started having Yizkor on festivals. It was in Yom Kippur sooner than that, but it was an evolution out of this. And so it's such an interesting history to me that our experience with not just anti-Semitism, but deep, intense hate and loss led us to be able to celebrate all of the loved ones in our lives. And today, right, most of those losses are not to hatred or anti-Semitism. And so I want to ask, like, how does this history, understanding this evolution of this prayer, how does it affect our experience of Yizkor? And how does it affect our experience of how we process the intensity of our time?
I would say that most people obviously think of Yizkor as really a moment where they remember their loved ones, and but putting in the historical perspective is really interesting. This was the Yizkor service was created for to recall communities that where everybody was murdered, so that therefore there was no one to say Kaddish for them. That's the history of that. And I guess what you're saying also that there are times that when we move away from this kind of hatred, there's always an ebb and flow in everything that we do, and so in the times that anti-Semitism and persecution was a little less, we would move away from it, but then it would come back to us. But I think it's also interesting. I think if all of us recall the history of Yizkor, it's going to change the way that we encounter it on the Chagim that which we actually recited. And by the way, it's my understanding is that Sephardic and Oriental and Yemenite communities don't have Yizkor as part of their liturgy because they didn't actually live through the traumas of the Crusades, which is really a European thing.
It's very variable. The Italian community do have it, and some Sephardic do, but some also don't, and the Oriental definitely don't.
Yeah, but we cannot talk about anti-Semitism without talking about Inquisition in Spain.
Course, yeah, well,
And all the Sephardim come from Spain.
Yeah.
So
I find this really interesting. So, as the only non-cantor in this circle, I
one of the best singers.
Thank you, Dan. I had never been aware of the evolution of Yizkor out of this moment. So thank you so much for bringing us that historical context. It feels to me like this prayer, the Av HaRachamim, holds a container of anger and pleading to God to have retribution, to destroy those who want to destroy us. And it's a prayer that we really needed and perhaps sometimes again may need. But when you speak about Yizkor having flowed out of it, and you ask the question that you asked, which is sort of what do we make of the fact that now it's neutered, it's missing that anger that was in the original. I actually am thinking a lot about the moment that we're in this 15 months that we've just been through. And we've had a lot of loss. We've been to a lot of funerals, and our members have been to a lot of funerals. And the question is, we have all that anger that's expressed there, but no direction. There's no enemy that's coming to destroy us. And how could we continue to give voice to that? We can't. It's diffuse. There's nowhere for that to go.
What do you mean by there are no enemies?
Meaning that coronavirus has killed indiscriminately.
Sorry.
It's
You
not,
took
you
it-
know,
you
they're
took it
not
to the virus, not to
crusaders, to the
anti-Semitism.
virus. Yes. So there's no, you can't say, you know, God, come and redress the blood of your servants when you're talking about a virus. And perhaps as we're moving through history and we're encountering different ways that people lose their lives, we still find that we need that first container. We still need to have a way to lift up the memory of those that we love. And so you create a more generic all-purpose prayer. Is that what you're trying to get at?
I think that my take is, you know, many times I thought about the following. When Israel was established in 48 and they had to do the War of Independence, somebody may have thought, okay, 1951, 1952, let's go back to Germany. Let's go back to Poland and kill every single one of those who are alive, who send us to the ghettos and to the concentration camps. And that never happened. So that speaks about how do we see ourselves as a religion and as people, that, you know, it could be led into the El Maleh instead of the Abarachamim. You know, going from this revenge, the bloody revenge, which at some point we all have inside ourselves, to a more humanly, you know, trying to make things better for the whole world.
But I want to point out something that you said when we were talking in your office yesterday, that we do have a space for anger towards God. And you had pointed out a specific text, I think it was from a German Siddur, was it a French? Was it French? Was it German? I forget. Which actually has a whole text about taking God to task. So,
It's here. It's
Yes,
Alisa
I was just
included
say
it.
it's
Yeah.
on page 5 of the source sheet. So
Yeah,
it's a
yeah.
piyut that was written by a French rabbi.
Right.
Yeah,
So-
that is specifically talks. Can I say something about that?
Go for it.
That specifically talks about the 1242 burning of the Talmud in France. To make a long story short, some members of the government in France accused the Jewish people in France to using the Talmud, which was a very sacred book for them, and having the material containing a lot of things against Christians and Catholicism. So they went to the Pope that you mentioned before. What was his name?
Pope Gregory?
Yes,
The time?
Gregory. And they convinced him, they traveled all the way to Rome, and they convinced him that the Talmud was a horrible book. So they decided to publicly burn 1,000 Talmud. What's the plural of Talmud? Talmudim? Talmudot? Anyways, 1,000 Talmuds. All right? 1,000 Talmuds in France publicly. And think about the following. Printed, you know, books didn't happen until 200 years later. So these were handwritten, 1,000 handwritten Talmudim, Talmudot, Talmudei. All right? And this is horrible. And that is what that piyut was created that we recited in Tisha B'Av.
Right, and
Elias, only
alongside
you
that-
can speak about the burning of Talmud in the public square and the visceral devastation of the core of our Jewish people and make us laugh.
Yeah, so I think one of the things I want to come back to, and we're going to move on to Birkat Aminim, which specifically has to do with that period of history and the way that it unfolded. But one of the things I want to just highlight here is that the revenge that we're talking about is not revenge that's enacted by the Jewish people. There's no imagination of us actually going out and doing anything to right this situation. It's all about God. And so it's a very interesting place for me because it's deep anger. And I think that's a really important emotion to lift up. Like, particularly when we have no control, right? Our people in antiquity really had no power. They were they had no retribution. They had no way of enacting revenge. But they did have this prayer that, like, let there be justice. Let there be revenge was their vision of justice. And it's asking God to intervene. And I find that to be such an interesting and challenging, problematic way of thinking about God, because there was no time throughout this entire history that God actually did that. Like there's no time. You think about 1026, and then you think about 1096, and then you think about 1100s, and then you think about all the expulsions, and you think about all the persecutions, all the burnings, all the people who lost their lives. There's no moment in which God actually does anything, or at least anything that we can see, and yet people keep reciting this prayer and keep having that hope that there could be revenge and there could be justice.
Well, I just the one time that God does actually exact revenge is on the Egyptians. So the hope goes back to then. So in other words, if God did it once, then God may do it again.
Yeah, and yet we were talking about this yesterday, just a small footnote. When we read the Megillah of Purim that you chant so well in chapter 10, at the end, oh boy, you know, when Haman is out of business, and what do the Jewish people do? They go and they kill 30,000 Persians. Ooh, let's talk about bloodshed there. All
Well,
right?
and also really interestingly there, what also happens as a result of the Purim story is a bunch of forced conversions. Or maybe we don't see them as forced conversions. We just see a bunch of people who are not Jewish who decide to save their lives by becoming Jewish, in very much the same way that happened during the Crusades.
There we go. Hak Purim, Hak Purim, Hak
Right, but
Gadol
it's
Hayeladim.
interesting that you say this prayer is not included in our prayer books now. We definitely do not include those last chapters of our
Chanted very well that-
We do. We read
in
them every year.
in our family service, right? So the question is, as we're praying, you know, I'm famously, Eileen and Beckman and I have this conversation every year where we're trying to change the lyrics of that old Haman, oh, once there was a wicked, wicked man, and we talk about hanging him from the gallows, and Eileen is always, oh, that's not very appropriate for children. and that's our story. Like, that's our story, is a story of suffering and pain and loss that is really not appropriate for children, and yet it is still our story. And that goes back to
Yeah,
our
but
conversation
not- I mean,
last week.
There is an effort, we have to agree on this. There is an effort in our rabbinical sages and in our Hasidim to sort of push aside all that aspect of our tradition. Because think about the Maccabim and think about why that wasn't incorporated into some Bibles. Because, you know, it's, you know, Be'ala milchamot she'asita lavoteinu beyamim ha'em b'zman hazeh, then we change it for niflaot, which is marvels instead of wars. So there is an aspect in Jewish history that we were bad.
Yeah, but there's also a tension in Jewish history, which is that all the things that we aspire to, getting back to your original point, Eliza, about, you know, we want to create a world of peace and blessing and joy and comfort, and we want to create for our children, for the next generation, a legacy that you will not have the kind of challenges in this world. You can build a better world, and yet, Elias, like, how do we transmit this reality of you may be confronting these kinds of facts? Do we still need this prayer? Do we still need those last chapters of Purim to be saying loud and clear to our
Asking me
children?
personally,
yeah.
I agree 100%.
I'm going to
They
say,
should be on.
I want to jump in and say yes.
They
also.
should be on.
Yeah, and
By the way, are we
yeah.
still on?
Yeah, what's up?
I hope so.
Yeah, I want to say
No one's
yes.
come in to say
This
otherwise.
is what- so one of the things we've been worrying about is the generation, our younger generation, who exhibit Jews that exhibit anti-Israel tendencies, not having a background, not having an understanding, and what we just said about when we say, oh, it's not good for children to learn about this stuff. I think that this is actually a place where we have actually lost touch with the reality. And if you go back to the, even if you go back to the 1800s, and we learn the Grimm fairy tales, and I always thought that was an adjective, but it's actually the name of the people that wrote them. Did you know?
Depends whether you're reading the real Grimm fairy tales or the pretend ones.
But when you, not the Disney version, but
Right.
the real ones, right? So children were taught from a young age that the world is not a pleasant place, that it's dangerous, and when you read those fairy tales, they're really about teaching.
Beisham de Lavoteinu.
Yeah.
Pesach.
So the idea
Translate
that
Elias.
when as we
You're better at translation.
continue to eliminate teaching our children about reality, so that when they become older, they don't have a sense of the reality of the fear of what the world really is.
Yeah, so just quickly, Beisham de Lavoteinu, I remember we were in March of the Living, and then we traveled to Israel. That's one of the most beautiful things. You fly on a plane with all Jews from all the world, leaving Poland, seeing Israel. And then the whole trip ends on Yom Ha'atzmaut in Israel, in the Kotel, and we had this great Hazan, the official Hazan of the Tzahal in Israel, singing Beisham de Lavoteinu. Oh my God. it was amazing. And the translation is, help me out here, it's a paragraph that we recite in Pesach. En cada generación, oh, I'm sorry, that's Spanish. Like in every generation, they stood against us in
Correct.
order to kill us.
In order to kill us.
Yeah.
Yes. So
And I want to move us, because we're going to now come to Birkat Minim, which is one of the blessings that's in the Amidah. Birkat Minim was, we talk about the Amidah as being 18 blessings. And in the Talmud, it raises, you'll see here on the source sheet number 3, the Talmud, it raises, like, what are you talking about 18? There's 19. And the reason is that and now this is where we have to sort of either believe our tradition or ask our tradition what's going on here. Because after the destruction of our temple, it said that Rabban Gamliel instituted this blessing. Now, at that time, how was the temple destroyed? We learned this a few weeks ago. The temple was destroyed because we couldn't get along, because we were fighting with each other, because Jews against Jews, because Jews were ruining it for other Jews. And so the temple was destroyed. Or you could say that the temple was destroyed because we couldn't figure out a way to work together to figure out a way out of that siege. Whatever, the answer is that we caused our own destruction. And so bemoaning that fact, this prayer was instituted against those who would fight against the Jewish people, or maybe not fight is the right word, but who acted against the interests of the Jewish people. Later, it comes to be seen that this is really a response to those apostates, and that specifically has meaning during the medieval period, because there were Jewish informants who would go to the Dominican friars, who would go to Christian leaders and show them texts in our Sidurs and show them texts in our Talmud that showed that Jews were out to get Christians, and Jews that really betrayed the Jewish people as a way of gaining power, as a way of they thought saving their lives. It didn't end up working. But the deepest fear that the Jewish people had were from those Jewish traitors. And so this blessing comes about as a result of that, and it's still a blessing that we have in our Siddur today. So Michelle, I'm hoping you can read just the English translation. This is something that still exists. We talk a lot about blessings that have been changed and altered. This exists in our conservative Siddurim. We'll take a look at the Reform adaptation. That's very different on the next page.
You want the actual bracha, or you want from brachot?
The actual bracha.
Okay.
So it's number 4.
Let there be no hope for informers, and may all wickedness instantly perish. May all the enemies of your people be swiftly cut off, and may you quickly uproot, crush, rout, subdue the insolent. Speedily in our days, blessed are you, Adonai, crusher of enemies and subduer of the insolent.
Excellent reading. And what's interesting about that is we have a practice of during our prayers. Elias, I wonder if you can share about the practice of how we recite this when we were leading prayers.
yeah, we were talking about this, and I want you to mention your version as well. Sorry, Michelle, we are going to talk about Nusach now. And so Nusach, it's usually translated as musical formula used to lead certain parts of the service. That varies depending on the time of the day and the days of the week. So basically, when I'm chanting this part as the repetition of the Amida, I use that's the way I was taught, very soft voice for the entire paragraph, and try to use as less as possible notes, musical notes in terms of variety, to monotone and with a small, volume.
Can you model that, how you do it?
And then Ala Tzadikim, the next paragraph, I say it super loud because it's Ala Tzadikim, Hasidim, Be'ala Israel, for the righteous, for all the Jewish people. And that's the way I was taught. But you...
Well, before I get to me, I just want to say that
we cannot
had
talk
been the
about that,
practice.
but anyways...
And one of the things I find so interesting is that this paragraph was actually censored throughout history. This paragraph actually received great ridicule from the Christians. There was concern that they were talking about Christians. And in fact, if you go back to El Bogan, who has a history of liturgy, he talks about actually there was the word Christians specifically in here. And actually, it wasn't just the informers. It was actually apostates. And actually, the language was much harsher during the time of the Crusades. And afterwards, Christians who were in power actually took our Siddurim and actually blotted out words that they didn't want and substituted words that they actually wanted. There were all sorts of cases. They also had a policy where they could come into synagogues, and 3 times a year, every Jew had to come listen to them teach in our synagogues. And so part of the question I have about how this evolved to be a quiet recitation of this prayer is whether it was a concern about people hearing and understanding what was being said, and they didn't want to take it out completely, but they also didn't want it to jeopardize their lives. I shared, and sorry, I'll let you jump into that. But when we were talking about this ahead of time, I've shared that for much of my early prayer practice, I hated this bracha and would skip it or would avoid it or would recite it as just as quietly as that. And then there were periods in my life where I saw individuals in this world who I felt like were demonizing, or realities in this world that I felt like were demonizing, were persecuting. And I think about the genocides that are unfolding now, and in light of those genocides, that was the first time that I ever felt like I wanted to say, like, yeah, this is, I'm with this blessing, and I want to bring that out. Like, I don't have any power to change this reality. I don't have any power to save all those lives, but I do hope that there's some God out there that's gonna do something about it.
Yeah, I want to say something. So, I'm going to say something that perhaps some people may find it controversial, but one advantage I have over all of you, that when you say something controversial, it's very clear, because everybody can understand how easily and how beautiful you speak English. I have the excuse, no, I never meant to say that. It was my accent. You couldn't understand what I was saying. Anyway, so here we go. So this is not my personal opinion. I don't want to bring my personal opinion to here, but I want to say that let's think for a minute if this prayer today, in this day and age, doesn't apply to the extremes of Jewish people, that we are in politics, thinking that we may have some traitors among ourselves. Meaning, this is not me. Some people who think that the Jewish people who are accusing Israel of being the ethnic cleansing and all the bad things that you see in the press, that this prayer doesn't apply to them. It's a topic we can discuss, and we should do it in a balcony scene, not bringing our opinions. But at many times this prayer comes alive in different times of the Jewish history. So it was my accent. I didn't say that.
No, but I think that's totally right. And I think one of the things that feels really challenging for me, like, I work with a lot of young people, and I hear a lot of young people saying things like "Free Palestine." And while I am deeply in support of Palestinians in Israel getting more support and having their own land and being able to be at peace and empowered, I don't like that Free Palestine phrasing, because Free Palestine is all of Israel. And so it feels like here is a case where, particularly young people, I don't think people always think through what that means, what they're saying it, and language matters, and how we speak matters. And I think that there's a lot of, maybe this is because in our Jewish community we haven't figured out ways to talk about Israel or anti-Semitism or Zionism in ways that bring us all together, in ways that we can really think through things together. And so maybe that means that things get pushed off the table and we stop talking and we stop working with these ideas. But I think that there is a sense that, sometimes we feel like there are people in our tribes who are actually, who don't see eye to eye with us, and who aren't protecting the land of Israel or standing up for the land of Israel in ways that we would like. And I'm not sure that this blessing actually works on that, because I think what we really need is to have deep conversations and to be thinking together about what are we saying, and what are the words that are coming out of our mouth mean, and what do we want them to mean, right? Because I can say something, right, as you shared, Elias, I can share something and people can hear something that I actually didn't intend for them to hear. We have to work on that together, and we have to get there together.
I want to say also, to just go back to the idea of the liturgy, and it's really interesting how some of our prayer practice was actually created because of our relationship with the greater community, with the Catholic community, the Christian community. We have the Shema early in the service, right? And why do we have it there? One of the reasons that was actually put in early in the liturgy is that there used to be guards, from other cultures that would come and listen to the prayers, and they were, especially the Romans, they were frightened to death, literally, of the Shema. So that they thought it was a call to war. They would hear people sing it. Really, this is the MS. I was there. I'm oldest, right? So the earlier Shema was added in so that the Roman guards, they were like all good Jews. They weren't there early in the service, and so they didn't hear that recitation of the Shema, so that it allowed people to say the Shema quietly and be able to do it without necessarily being fearful of retribution. So that's another practice that we have that was created in relation to what the church told us we could do or not do.
Could I ask a question? Cantors, please. So you brought the Av Harachamim, and you showed us how that has sort of edged out of our, at least, liberal liturgy, and to the extent that we still carry it forward, it has actually been transformed into a different prayer. And then you led us into this meaning prayer where you said that there were 18 and now this is the 19. And I want to ask the three of you, why do you think that's stuck? I mean, in rabbinical school, I didn't go to cantorial school, but in rabbinical school, right, they teach us that originally when there were the 18 blessings, when you originally had the Amidah, people could freestyle those. There was a period of time where all of that was kind of evolving and it wasn't necessarily clear. It wasn't written in a book. You would come and you knew the basic themes and you would do jazz on the prayers. And at some point in time, you got this idea that they are static, they're fixed, but of all the many prayers that we could have had as our 19th, why do you think this one stayed in its form, in the exact form that it has, even though if you're talking about the historical context, you're telling me that historical context is different.
Well, and this form is actually not its original form. We actually don't know what the original form is. It's gone through so many changes. But I think your basic question, which is like, why does this, I would say this idea, this intention stay, is a really good question. I guess my answer would be, I think that it responds to a deep need that we have. That how do you understand? And I think this is the heartbreak at the heart of this prayer. How do you understand when somebody that's supposed to be on your side, that's supposed to be rooting for you, that's supposed to be supporting you, turns against you, and you have no recourse? This prayer is that answer.
Yeah, and also you included in this booklet the version that it's used in the weekday tefillah in the Reform book.
Will you read that translation?
And it's changed. So you have it here on evil on top of the page on the left. Let the reign of evil afflict us no more. May every errant heart find its way back to you. Oh, help us to shatter the dominion of arrogance to raise. So it's a completely different thing. Even the text, instead of el amashinim, velarisha al tihi tikva. So to the bad evil, not specifically talking about people, but in general, a general concept. So it has
It's not
evolved.
you, it's your behavior.
Right, exactly. So it has evolved. It has evolved, and the original text had different things as well. Not velamalshinim ala neinim was one of the original text.
But here's my question: you're asserting that this is the 19th, right? This is the one that has been added. So if it's not just that the rabbis are bad at math, but that there's there's something, that we felt we needed to put in our service that has to stay with us. It has to walk with us. And it's so important that out of all the possibilities that could have become the 19th, it's this one. If that's what you're asserting,
I believe
why?
that the concept of this is that these people who included, to me, this is my take, is that for them, it was more fearful, more dangerous, not the external enemies, but the internal enemies.
That's incredible,
how much danger and how endangered the Jewish people could be because of those, and not because the external forces.
And that's so beautiful. But here's a question, guys: if our prayers work, our prayers are not about them. Our prayers are about us.
So this is why it works. This is why it works, because this prayer, was added because originally Christians were Jews, and so this would actually, in a way, as Elias pointed out, this was an internal struggle. So this would actually point out that if someone were an early Christian Jewish person, if they were asked to lead a service, they would get up and they couldn't say this because it would actually be pointing out that they're against themselves. The other thing, liturgically, there's also this possibility that we could still have 18 brachot, because originally at Tzemach David and V'Yerushalayim Ircha was actually one bracha, which then became bifurcated at some point. So if you would have put those back as to one bracha, then you still have 18, which is that's a whole different mathematical question about how you want to.
Right. Well, I was going to say, we
yeah. No,
next
your math is
week
right.
we'll
Yeah.
be doing all of liturgy, and we'll be going specifically into how you count 18. No. Though actually, I just want to say I really wanted to send out as the teaser for this class. I wanted to say, like, please join us as we totally nerd out on liturgy, because this just feels like the most exciting thing to talk about. But I think that point that,
You should explain what we did yesterday.
oh my gosh, yesterday, so
We
Dan-
were in my office for an hour, and we pulled Sidorim from here, books. It was like 20 books in the table, and the three of us were talking about this stuff and passionately discussed.
it was so blessed. We were pulling through. I mean, there's so many other prayers. If you want to stay with us, like, oh my gosh, we can do hours. But I think that Michelle, the point you bring about we pray for ourselves, not for others, I don't think that the Siddur sees that. I actually think the Siddur thinks that we actually have the capacity in our prayers to change the world around us and change other people around us.
No, I would specifically say them historically. Thank you for clarifying. Elias was giving us, them back then, they were using it in this historical context. And what I want to say is that if you have longevity in our prayers, those prayers are not meant for some historical community that experienced it within a particular context.
Right.
They're meant to speak to us in
Right.
every
And that
age
is-
and at
that-
every stage.
I don't know why specifically these people did that. Maybe Dan can answer because he was there. But I love you, Dan. You said it before, so that gives me a chance to talk about it. But if you look historically, that wasn't the only case. Think about in Spain what happened to the Marranos. The Marranos were the conversos. They were forcibly, they forcibly converted, but some of them converted easily and say, yes, I'm ready to leave my tradition. And then think about a very controversial topic that we rarely talk, the capos during the Holocaust. The capos were the Jewish people working in the concentration camps for the Nazis. So it has been historically, unfortunately, many cases where this prayer comes alive.
And we can even talk about the fact that maybe our younger generation is for us Lamoshinim, those people Free Palestine, those younger people that don't get it. Let's
clarify. That's how some people see it, not us.
Right, exactly. I'm saying maybe we could do that. In other words, these are people who are that are at odds with with much of what many of us believe, which is that Israel has the right, Israel has the right to exist. And if you say Free Palestine, as you say, it's all of Israel. And how can our kids not get that? And so they are a force within the Jewish community that are bifurcating us, that we're just hoping will see the light at some point, but also just we have to be cautious of how we approach that whole connection. But it's also a prayer that we have that that these people will not internally destroy the Jewish community.
Right. And I think part of this for me, the form is really important, right? Like the way that we respond in antiquity, the way we respond now is not through massive action. It's not through blasting social media. It's not through talking about how stupid people are, how dumb they're being. It's through prayer. And I think that there's a really important distinction between the communication we have in our prayers and the communication we have with each other. And so, our goal today had been, like, how do we look through the liturgy of our past, liturgy that evolved during the periods of most intense anti-Semitism, for answers to how we respond today. And I think, our final question, and I'll start off, and then would love to hear all of your wisdom, is that, how do these texts teach us? I think for me, the lesson of this text is that it's really important for us to have a space to just speak and to be angry and to be vitriolic and to be like outraged and to just be open. And that space is with God. And then the work that we have to do with one another is more intentional. That work is relationship building. That work is asking, when you say this, what do you mean? When you say, for example, our Free Palestine, what is it that you mean? Do you mean what I think you mean based on those languages, or are you saying something else? And can I understand what you're saying? And can we work together? Can I share with you what it feels like for me when I hear you say X? And can we get to a shared place where we're able to work towards the best world possible for all of us? I think those are two really different steps. And so if I were looking at our tradition, I think my vision would be that we have two moves, one that's recorded in antiquity and one that we have yet to write.
My take on all this is that we have come a long way using a prayer book that, based on my take, it has to represent us as human beings with every single emotion we have through our lives and through our experience. And that book has all these prayers. Prayers when you really need to be angry with external forces or internal forces like these two, that you brought up, and many cases where we feel differently and we are experiencing a different time in Jewish history at times that we don't need to say those prayers. But the fact that they are there, I just love it.
That's caught up in the form in the words of Harachamim, Father of mercy, destroy and kill all the people that hate us. Pull and push. So exactly what Elias just said, all the emotions rolled up. And, there's a great book, if people haven't read this, it's called God, a Biography. If you haven't read that, it's an awesome book. And it talks about the evolution of God as, El Kana to Harachamim, and how God, God, and so God's appearance in all of our liturgy and all of our Torah, it's in many ways reflections of who we are as human beings at various points and stages in our lives.
Michelle, you got the last word.
Well, I just want to say thank you, colleagues. Really, just fascinating, interesting, opens up different rooms in my heart. I think a lot about the teaching that we actually see liturgy not only as the prayers that we lift up towards God, but also as a life curriculum. And so I think I have a takeaway from this session that we need to continue to explore our prayers and to continue to bring our contemporary challenges to those prayers and ask, what is it I'm meant to learn here today? And how can I use that to help lift our world? So thank you.
Amen, amen. Boker tov,
Boker
everyone.
tov.
Shabbat shalom.
See you in 10 minutes.
Yes.